This is Sara-Jayne Parsons, the director and curator of the art galleries at TCU, and I'm delighted to be here today and introduce our guest artists, Richie Budd, Kris Pierce, and John Rasimus. And they're going to be talking to us today about their solo exhibitions that will be opening at Fort Worth Contemporary Arts on February 25th. And the three exhibitions exist under one sort of umbrella concept, one idea, the idea of persona. I'm going to be talking to the artists about that in just a moment. But first, to sort of break the ice, I'd like the artists to introduce themselves briefly, or perhaps they'd like to introduce each other's. How about we start with you, John Rasimus, who is joining us from Sweden. We're really glad that you could come all the way to Texas in the middle of a pandemic. That's no small feat. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks, John. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a installation artist, mixed media artist, make both from videos, but mostly prints and drawings. And usually have like museum and art gallery shows, and that's why I came up with the concept of folding my prints to make them take the room more space in the room, because I discovered years ago when I was having museum shows that everything was up. I was placing everything on the wall and I didn't have anything in the middle. And now I'm doing the opposite. I put everything in the middle and nothing on the wall.
Right. So you're being like a revolutionary printmaker.
Yeah.
Taking it off the wall, right?
Yeah.
Well, we're excited to see exactly what you're going to do at Fort Worth Contemporary Arts with this experimental way of working with printmaking. Thank you and welcome, John. Richie, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I live in Texas.
That's a good start.
Well, what would you like to know?
Richie, tell us a little bit about, maybe your connection to John, because it was really through you, Richie, that this whole project came about. You had been in contact with me. We talked a little bit about potential for an exhibition or for a project, and you introduced me to the work of John. And I know that you've spent time, obviously not only with your own practice here in the U.S., but you've been back and forth to Sweden a couple of times and done some projects with John there. So maybe just tell us a little bit about how you've done that and what that relationship's like.
We met in 2006 at the Triangle Art Association. They had a 2-week, was it 2-week workshop or 1-week workshop?
I think it was
2 weeks?
Yeah, I think so.
And it was one floor in Dumbo, New York. It was kind of an industrial space right off the street, and 20-something other artists were there. And we all had our own space marked out in tape on the floor, and we met there, and John's so outgoing, we kept in contact, and I finished up my grad work, and he found what was the first thing was...
Well, actually I can add something that Richie's work is, what I saw was the things that you glue together, and we don't have so many artists in Sweden that work in this direction, and I thought that this was hilarious, fun, and great. And Richie is a great guy too, so I actually I have this gallery in Sweden, and I invited Richie to do a piece, so he came over to Sweden, but the problem in Sweden is that it's too clean. We didn't find the material that Richie usually find on the streets around here or in the backyards in Texas. So that was our first problem to build a sculpture, because we didn't find anything lying around. But you can continue on that one.
Yeah, and I think there was a thrift store that had shut down, and it was all unloaded into a giant barn. And John was able to, I don't know how he does it. He located the owner of the barn and the owner of all the objects, and they allowed John and I just to go through the whole barn and basically come up with a piece.
Nice.
And I've just kept in contact with John and have been attempting to get him, shows in the United States, and this one popped up thanks to you, and we, pulled Kris in, and
and it's all happening.
Yeah,
Kris been to Sweden too.
Yeah, Kris has been to Sweden as well.
Yeah. Okay, Kris, let's bring you in. Introduce yourself. You're the third artist of the project Persona.
Right. So I'm Kris Pierce. I live and work here in Fort Worth, Texas. I think like my work is always sort of evolving, but just generally speaking, it's rooted in a lot of things relating to like digital space, and I use a lot of like new media type technology. As much as I hate that word, I use a lot of like emerging technologies and stuff like that, and a lot of the work that I make. But I think I'm trying to think of like what my connection to you originally is, Richie. We kind of crossed paths a little bit, like when we were both in Denton, where we both went to undergrad at the University of North Texas. And we were both kind of like independently involved in a couple of like different artist collectives and stuff like that. But I think there was some original connection through that, and we just had reconnected later. And then that's when Richie had kind of introduced me to, I think, John. And at that point, there was like an opportunity to show some work. I don't believe that I didn't go when I actually did the first exhibition. Yeah.
Because at the gallery we usually have a summer show, and we don't have anyone that we can actually not have it open. So you fit the concept great because you have this video that we could have in the that you can pass by and see the video out from outside the front. Is that my phone? Probably. I'm surprised.
Sorry, Sweden on line 1. His phone's ringing.
It's the president.
No one ever calls me.
It's the president of Sweden.
No one ever calls me, sorry. That's fun.
I had a friend do that just to embarrass you.
No worries.
It's opportunity calling, John. You need to answer.
Yeah, it was Moma.
Moma.
What can you say? Sorry about that.
It's okay.
But yeah, I guess just to kind of like return to that. Yeah, I had an exhibition in Sweden, and then eventually did like go back to. I was invited to actually teach a virtual reality program at the university. So I had the experience of like being extremely jet lagged inside of like virtual reality, like meta space.
That sounds terrifying.
Like kind of horrible in its own way, but it was like a great trip and a great opportunity just to like get to know John more.
That sounds great. I mean, just thank you for kind of explaining those connections a little more for our audience. And John, it seems like you're pretty much a linchpin in this group of mischief, but then it's great to hear the individual projects that have developed because of that. So let's talk a little bit about Persona, and I'm going to describe the idea for our listeners today, and then I'd like you to jump in and correct me or add some flavor to the simple description. And you have described the idea of Persona as really loosely referencing Ingmar Bergman's 1966 film by the same title, Persona, which it's been a while since I've watched it, but it's really scary from what I remember. Or maybe I was just much younger when I watched it. But it's really an experimental psychological drama, and it's really renowned for the suggestion that the two main characters of the film experience some kind of emotional convergence. And I'm just really struck sitting here in the studio looking at the three of you together as this kind of convergence of activities, working together but not collaboratively, certainly connecting. I'm interested to hear more about that emotional convergence or the potential for that between the three of you. And so working under that umbrella idea of Persona at Fort Worth Contemporary Arts, you're going to be presenting 3 concurrent solo exhibitions. And in each exhibition, I'm understanding that your work really is circling ideas about identity, duality, and also questions around sort of character traits of individuals and how I say we, people, attempt to sort of distinguish and validate their existence as individuals. So through those individual presentations, what's really, I hope, going to be I think will be fascinating for our audiences is that you're doing that with a variety of media. So between real space and digital space, and particularly with Richie's work, the involvement of physical senses. And so it's really sort of a complicated coming together of these three very different practices that suggest some kinds of connections, but you're not really a collaborative. This isn't a group show. This isn't sort of a thematic idea. It's coming at the idea of persona in a much more abstract way. Thoughts?
Yeah, I would say, like, I think that the idea of persona or definition is a very, like, fluid definition, and this, like, particular approach to the exhibition and the idea of persona is, like, very meta in some way, that we're really, like, doing a show, 3 shows about identity and individuality inside a show about individuality. So I think that, each one of us is going to have something completely different probably to say about how we think about the exhibition. But at least from my perspective, a lot of the work that I make relates to individuality, or maybe specifically lately, like American individuality, and this idea of, like, us as a solo identity, or, we're being, like, a good citizen by pursuing this idea of, like, an individual, the frontiersman that is sort of, like, staking out on their own and sort of crafting what it is that we stand for. And I think that idea of persona and, like, how we present ourselves to the world is something that's just, like, personally interesting to me, like, in my individual work. But I think it's also interesting in the context or the dynamic of 3 artists, where art making in and of itself is kind of like this egotistical exercise. We think that we have something unique, like, to present to the world, or we have, like, a perspective that is unique in and of itself. And I think that it's kind of like turning the mirror back in and of itself. Like, if we're talking about individualism or identity, like, we're looking at the artist as, like, a central player in the context of an exhibition. So that's kind of how I thought about it. But then again, I think that's, like, there's a lot of, like, different layers in terms of how we each independently approach our work. And I think it's hard to bring together 3 artists that are so different and kind of find a way to unify that in a way that makes sense. But the thing that we all share as artists is that we're artists, we're making work that is sort of coming from our unique position, our unique identities. How we enter into that just, I think, changes and is fluid. But that to me is, like, what makes it interesting.
And that's something that I've been really fascinated with, and learning more about each of your works and your practice over the last few months that we've, really been focusing on the last details about this exhibition. And Kris, to go back to that word fluidity, and then also the question of the subject or subjectivity, that we're each in a very sort of, from a post-human approach, our subjectivities would be described as fluid and in flux and always changing. So it's hard to pinpoint sort of who we are as individuals kind of at any given moment. So for me, that's kind of going back to that idea of fluidity. That's kind of the energy of exchange between the 3 of you that I'm excited to see in the gallery when the work is all together.
Persona.
And also in the movie, this nurse, she goes with this actress Vogler to Fora to live in the cottage for a time being, and that's where everything happens, because they are in this room and they discover, I think the nurse discover how much she is the actress in a way, and the actress trying to be the nurse, and they're going back and forth, but like the actress doesn't talk. She's like studying the nurse that's there to take care of her, and everything gets, as you know, upside down and really scary. So I think also that we put each other in one room. We are individual players, as Kris says, but what will happen when we're like together there for a week or 3 months until August, what will be what happens? when you put 3 individuals in a room. And as Kris says too, every group show is about the individual in the group show too, always, because you never see the whole show. Actually, you see, oh, where's your thing, Richie, in the group show, or so it's kind of logic in a way to have a group show that is a solo show. We think, I guess.
Yeah, I think in the context of or work sort of existing in the context of each other, it just kind of it just adds a different layer of interest, just depending on what the sort of history or what the relationships are between the work. I mean, I think that I didn't necessarily see some of the relationships between my work and both of you guys' work until I started to be forced to think about it, because I knew that it was going to be sitting in context of it. But I think that that's something that once you start to put a spotlight on it, I think that maybe there's some more interesting ideas that come out of those relationships.
So Kris, what you're describing there is sort of an affective encounter, that being in proximity to the ideas and the work of these 2 other artists is asking you to think about your own practice and think about ways that you describe it in a relational way, rather than just as an individual practice, but in a relational situation.
Yeah. And then especially with your work, Richie, it's, at least for me, it's all about sort of these relational dynamics, it's all about, it's 3-dimensional in the best kind of way. And I mean, not 3-dimensional, just physical space, but honestly just psychic space, smell, the sort of distance between you and the sculpture and the parts of the sculpture.
Well, one of the most important things I consider in my artwork and in my life is who I want to be affected by. And that's the big part of it, was who do I want to be influenced by? And I mean, you guys are 2 of the most evolved artists I know right now. So I mean, we've all been through lots of different things, and Sara herself is. I mean, you're the kind of people we want to work with. if we could just keep finding those people out there. I mean,
they're
it'd
out
be.
there.
Oh yeah, that's
just like
that's
aliens. No.
Yes, you find the aliens.
So Richie, just following on from Kris's comments, tell our listeners a little bit about your work and what they will expect to find, or what they might encounter in the galleries when they see your work.
Well, my works stems from basically having a sensory experience. I attempt to use all the 5 senses in the work, including smell, taste, physical, touching, by using wind from a small fan, visual components, light projecting, and auditory sound components, frequencies of sound and stuff like that can attempt to influence the future memories of the viewer.
And I think that's an important kind of discernment, that there's an action that's that collection of actions within your works is to influence, or it's very generous to give something, or give an opportunity, give a moment for your audience. But I wouldn't describe your work as interactive per se, right? And there is a difference there, right? Although you do interact with the works yourselves in terms of kind of creating a performance in how you operate aspects of the sculpture, right? I'm thinking
That's
particularly of the George Foreman grill and what you would typically do with that.
I would cook wieners on it.
Nice. So there'll be hot dogs, the smell of hot dogs in the gallery, yum.
The smell of hot dogs.
We might not be tasting them.
They'll be tasted, hopefully.
One thing, one component about your work, though, it's not just fabricated out of nothing, content, material. It's actually discarded consumer goods and packaged goods and food, all these things that carry a lot of content with them.
And cultural capital.
Capital. which, you know, I think is just a really interesting intersection between, you know, John's work, who uses a lot of, I would say use like a lot of symbolic visual language in your work. And I think that that's another form of cultural capital. And then sort of intersecting with my work where it's about cultural capital as like identity in digital space, whether it be through like social media or, you know, things beyond that. It's like different definitions for the same thing being approached by artists that have like a unique perspective on it. That is really interesting. It's like a really interesting connection that I never really thought of, but it makes a lot of sense. And I don't think I'm just like teasing it out. I think it's actually there. So I feel like that was really like a serendipitous thing in the end. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I'm just curious, like, I guess for you, Richie, like, how do you select what goes into the work? Or do you?
They evolve. I mean, I started with, like I put a popcorn maker in one just because it did more than just sit there. And I noticed, I started thinking about where else is popcorn found? It's found in movie theaters. And when people walk in, it's a trigger. It's an anchor for like entertainment to come. So people walk into a theater and they're like, "Oh, I'm looking forward to this. This is getting me excited. I can smell the popcorn."
Yeah, and then like the smell is the sense that like triggers a memory more than anything else, right?
Yeah, that's the most reptilian. Yeah, it goes straight to the reptilian brain, basically. The amdula amangada.
Yeah. I guess like how do you respond to this idea of like some of the symbolism iconography that you use in your work, John? I mean, I know that maybe like the nature of printmaking is that there's things that get repeated. You know, where does like that content come from or the content that you gravitate come from?
Actually, it started when I was a student at the university. I started to, everything was like so cool and hip, like in the art world. And I was thinking, what's the worst thing that no one is doing right now? It was 91 or 92. And no one was making woodcuts. Mm-hmm. So I started to make woodcuts, and I made a big wood show with woodcuts. And then I found out it was very easy for me to work with and very fun. And from there I was like, as you say, I'm using a lot of symbols. So I never actually look at a wood log, drawing it, making it. I'm doing from my head the symbols that you have in the head. So the symbol of a hand. So if you've been teaching like a drawing, like modal, like nude drawing or something, usually you have students that they make a drawing with like all 5 fingers because they think it's there. Because the head says it's there. But then you ask them, do you really see the fingers? No, because there's then like, you know, hiding 3 of them. So you have so many iconic like figures in your head, like car, hand, wood. So usually I work with those symbols, the wig, hair. So it's all like that.
John, will you talk about the iconic symbol that you're working with for your presentation in the exhibition? The Outhouse.
Oh, yeah. So actually I was thinking about the group show that we have, because we had some meetings like via Messenger, Kris, Richie and I, and what we were about to do in the show. And I think Kris said, why don't you do an Outhouse? And I said, yeah, that will be good. So I guess that's how it went. So, and I've been making like dog houses and other things. In one show in Stockholm, the gallery owner had a dog. So I came there and I saw the dog, so I thought maybe I'll make a dog house. And now Kris said, well, why don't you make an outhouse? And I thought that was kind of fun.
Is the utility of those objects the thing that kind of drives you, or is it more like just that and the absurdity of making art that's an outhouse?
Yeah, I really I think it's more like it's a fun thing, and sometimes you just get so tired of art. Being in the art world, you think everything is like, why do people want to go and see my thesis art? Like, you know, and this is literary what I do, like the Outhouse and all the art thesis, if you can say that, like will be sprawled out, tossed around the Outhouse. But then it's not only that, because it's also about youth, being young, you know, finding your hideout where you can live out, where you can like drink or, you know, whatever, like a place where no adults are. They won't see you, whatever you're doing, what you experience. So it's behind, you know, everything can happen down at the Outhouse. Even new art will be made, or new kits will be made, or, you know, whatever. So new experience. So it tells a lot for me, but I don't know if you guys will see the whole thing. But
is there a fence around the house?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, that's something that's like interesting to me too, because it's like defining my space. Like, this is my space. You can't enter into it. Mm-hmm. You know, it's like sort of setting up some.
Yeah.
And the outhouse is pretty private. I mean, you know, you don't really want anybody coming into the outhouse while you're in there doing your personal things.
They don't make many low seats
Right.
for outhouses.
No, it's a singular endeavor, shall we say.
What's a low seat? What's low seat?
Love seat.
Love seat.
Oh, love seat.
Low seat. There's a high seat and a low seat.
You definitely want to be on the high seat.
But in Sweden, they actually had outhouse with like 3 or 4 holes, so you can go the whole family visit the outhouse, or bring your friend.
Is that because it's so cold that you just want to dash out there super fast?
I don't know. In Sweden,
Collectively stay warm.
in Sweden, probably here too, we call it the secret house, because you go there with your friend. If there are like 3 holes or something, and then you can talk about private things that no one else will hear.
You know what? It only just occurs to me as you're describing that and the secrecy of it. It's kind of like a confessional.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. Yeah, true. Yeah. I've been thinking about that too.
Yeah. That very private space that's made for 1 or 2 people like that. It's
But
confessions of the outhouse.
And never be too sure, because you will have someone listening outside, sneak up on you, listening on your secrets.
Outhouses are just like such an antiquated thing at this point. I just wonder what, you know, I mean, someone in maybe they're a teenager, how do they respond to like
Never
that
seen it.
object? I mean, do they know it's an outhouse? Do they know what an outhouse even is? You know? Like,
I mean, I think that's a good cultural question. And I mean, from my perspective or subjectivity is like thinking about it as a European is like our vision, or a European vision of America is very often mediated through, you know, movies, and particularly older historic movies, Westerns, right? Our understanding of America is through the Western. And there's very often that comedic moment where, you know, somebody, the kitchen maid or whoever falls out of the outhouse. There's always some kind of, you know, it's a sort of a comedic, but this sort of iconic kind of object within those histories. So when I first heard John talk about Outhouse, to me that was, I understood that through the filter of kind of, well, that's a very iconic architectural, popular cultural feature. It also felt very Texan because of that, kind of a bit Wild West. But yeah, I absolutely take your point, Kris, that really, how is the outhouse relevant to the students of TCU right now?
right.
It's a good question, and that'll be certainly conversations that we hope to prompt in the gallery.
Yeah, I think there's just a lot of, and maybe this is just me projecting, because maybe Americans just tend to project themselves into every single culture across the world because they think they're the most important in some weird way. But like there seems to be a lot of, you have like sort of an Elvis character that shows up a lot in your work, and then the kind of like 1920s boxer type of guy, and a lot of that stuff I feel like I really personally connect to, but I don't know if it's for the same reason that you do. And I don't know what that means, but I think it's just interesting, you know, that some of the work that you're making or that's coming out of Sweden, like I feel like feels distinctly American in some way.
Yeah, I guess growing up in Sweden, we have the village next to mine. It's like a rockabilly center of the world, and they have their own record company called Enviken Records, so we have a lot of Americana, a lot of cars, many cars, American cars, and the whole cult of America, like James Dean, Elvis Presley, and the clothes and the everything from. So I guess that's how I grew up. And also the cowboy stands for like freedom, and I like that thing that, you know, and so usually when I draw a cowboy, you could put like tears in his eyes, and then it becomes something else, like it dramatic. Why is the cowboy crying? And it's hard to find another symbol that is so profound that as a freedom fighter or whatever, and now he's crying. So it gets kind of interesting in that way. I couldn't, you know, if I have a dollar horse or a King Vasa or something, no one would know who it is, and everybody knows Vasa is crying. But it's actually the king of Sweden, Vasa. He actually fled through the outhouse when the Danish soldiers was hunting him. So that's a fun story to add to it. But no, so I think these symbols are very strong, and I like symbols, as I told you earlier.
And then what happens when they're mediated and available and used or experienced in other cultures, like that, how they're adopted, and for me that becomes the then sort of honky-tonk feel of your work in a similar way to how I think about the way that Richie's making his work, the components that come together to create more of an overall aesthetic, and the arrangement of those objects and how they work in relation to each other is kind of similar.
How did you start to, like, what were like the first instances of you starting to use that type of material in your work?
The five senses, or just
not even that, just like the physical material that you use.
I was my father had a vise in his garage and hammers and tools, and regular toys just got boring really quick, and so I just was making my own toys in the garage, smashing them and crushing them and cutting them up and gluing them back together in different ways and stuff. So, yeah.
And is that just to see what they look like?
Oh,
is it the making, or is it like at the end, the looking? It's both.
Yeah, both.
Well, and then I like too, like the material that you use it's not like, I mean, unless I'm totally like missing something, like it's not antique material. It's not stuff from like, you know, the 19th century. It's all very like 21st century like material, which I think is interesting because there's just like a level of disposability to a lot of its stuff, and when you start to put it in an art context, I think it just gives it like the platform or the stage to just look at it in a different way, which I always find personally really interesting. And I think that especially when it comes to, you know, one-use consumer materials, when they're elevated in that way, you just look at the world different, which I think is what art is all about in a lot of ways. So I've always, you know, found that interesting. I think that, you know, to speak from my perspective, there's such an inundated with like digital content and, you know, personas in digital space and stuff like that. And I tend to approach a lot of the work that I make from the same standpoint, where it's taking moments in time that are typically ephemeral and then kind of like freezing them in a way to look at them from a different perspective, or, you know, very much the same way with symbols, where like a symbol becomes a symbol through repetition, and something that's repeated endlessly, sometimes when it's frozen, sort of an inverse effect to what happens in physical space. So that's just a connection that I see between some of those ideas.
Yeah, I see John and Richie are really, it's the materiality that's kind of driving the forms and the questions that they have. And then, Kris, you're working in this virtual space, and sometimes also because you're working within a sculptural form and you make paintings, becomes this liminal space between the virtual and the real, and kind of how you're mediating back and forth. Could you, in that moment, in that place, could you tell us a little bit more about the idea of the main character that you're exploring in your work?
Right. Yeah. So I think like the idea of a main character in digital space has existed for since its inception. But what I've been interested in, specifically in this work, is this main character hashtag that sort of started to really take off in probably September of 2021 and become pretty prolific across TikTok and then ultimately, other social media platforms. But it's really revolved around this idea of seeing yourself as like the protagonist in the story of your life and acting out this sort of hyper reality version of individualism on these platforms. So a lot of them are set to music, music from the 80s and stuff like that, where people will post videos of themselves acting out this sort of like main character identity. And that's like one definition of it. I think that, in and of that, it started to be used as kind of like shorthand for someone that's really selfish or obsessed with themselves. But I don't think that it's an entirely negative act on the part of the people that are sort of adopting these identities. I think that there's different layers relating to, finding one's place in the world. There's things relating to like self-identity, coping, with what's been going on for the past couple of years, or even just dealing with their own personal identity, like as a teenager or something like that. So that's one thing that's been interesting about this main character idea that I've been exploring in a lot of the work that I've been making. But, beyond that, I think that it relates in an interesting way to just American individualism. I think that, we're not a collectivist society in the United States. I think that we're part of American identity revolves around this idea of like the individual. Like if you're being an individual, if you're going out, you're being the frontiersman and you're kind of like putting your stake in the ground and saying, I stand for this, like you're being a good American. And I think this is just an interesting manifestation of that. It's not.
And do you think it's been sort of amplified by sort of the political landscape of the last few years, or is this just something that you've seen kind of naturally sort of evolving through increased use of social media and new platforms?
I mean, I think that these things come and go in sort of like waves, just depending on, where how you're looking at it. I think certainly there's moments, there's history where individualism was sort of like at the top of the zeitgeist of like where the country was at the time. I think that we're probably in a similar circumstance, but I'm not, I think this is an inherently like human trait. It's not specifically tied to like that on its own. I think that's one way to look at it and approach it. I think that we've continued to just become more isolated as a society in general, and especially over the past couple of years with everything happening during like this pandemic and stuff. I think that it's continued to isolate people. So
it's kind of like the isolation of John's outhouse, the alienation of that single form, and then Richie's in between trying to coax something outside of that alienation. I'm not sure. Richie, help me out.
Right. Sounds good.
Awesome. Oh, man. That was great. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
I haven't seen many of your paintings, Kris, and I just there's a lot of iconography in those that are kind of similar just visually to some kind of how John's working a little bit. Could you talk about the piece that's it's going to be in the show this time? Because I've seen like a little tiny photo of it, but I haven't.
Yeah. So there's actually two. There's one painting, and then there's one that's sort of like in between painting and sculpture, I would say. But I was making paintings a long time ago, and then I just sort of recently returned to it, partially just to sort of manage some of. It's a good way to just sort of like manage your day in some way. Like painting is such like a meditative process, and that's something I felt like I just needed to return to, especially in the context of making work that was happening inside of like the computer, which is not it's not like a healing environment to be inside of. So that was one of the reasons that I started to like move into making more physical work. But yeah, a lot of the imagery that I use in the paintings that I've been making come out of like these 1950s and 60s hyper like chauvinist cartoons, and a lot of the ones that you would see in like Playboy magazine and these like I guess like comic rag magazines that they would put out like in the 60s and stuff like that. But they very much like prescribe themselves to these tropes of like men and women and people of like different cultural backgrounds and stuff at the time in a way that is at times like shocking and extremely negative and inaccurate. But the thing that was interesting to me about that is that the same way that things become symbols through repetition, like these comics through repetition of like these character personas or identities and stuff started to connect what was maybe fiction or comic fiction into like reality. So this idea of the businessman and like what that stands for and like what they're allowed, where they sort of sit in the context of like a joke is something that I think starts to factor into like real life perception and how people think about like identities of different types of people and things like that. So that's really where I started or my interest like in that type of imagery started, and then sort of like taking that and putting it in a context where it's played against some of the other things that I think ideas of like identity and stuff like that have a little bit more of like a contemporary nature to them. So it's really just like connecting this thread of the way things were and the way things are today in a way that I think is just a little bit like timeless and interesting personally.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing it, and also that the meta piece, the digital piece with the TikTok and stuff. It's going to be great. I can't wait to see it.
Thanks.
Yeah, looks really amazing.
Well, I'd like to thank our guests for an illuminating discussion today to learn more about the idea of persona and the umbrella of ideas around the 3 concurrent solo shows that are happening at Fort Worth Contemporary Arts. I'd like to thank you each, Kris, Richie, John. Thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing about your practices and also kind of commenting and questioning of each other. It's been interesting to see that and pull at those threads of the ideas for the overall concept within your individual shows and your own practices. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.